Ethan Carter moved through the bustling corridors of the emergency room with a practiced ease, his warm smile a comforting presence amid the chaos. The sounds of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and the occasional shout for help filled the air, creating a symphony of urgency. The ER was a world of its own, a place where life and death often danced in close proximity, and Ethan was a steady hand guiding patients through their most vulnerable moments. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," Ethan called out, approaching an elderly man sitting on a gurney, his face pale and lined with worry. "How's your breathing today?" Mr. Johnson, who had been a regular visitor due to his chronic respiratory issues, looked up at Ethan with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "A bit better, thanks to you, Ethan. I don't know what I'd do without you." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. "Just doing my job, sir. Remember to take your medications on time, okay? I'll check back in a bit." He patted the man's shoulder gently before moving on, his heart swelling with the satisfaction of helping those in need. As he navigated through the emergency room, Ethan's thoughts drifted to Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with a spirit as resilient as the tattered clothes she often wore. She was a regular at the hospital, visiting frequently for minor ailments, but her true reason for coming was the companionship she found within those walls. Over the months, they had formed a bond. He listened intently as she shared tales of her youth, her laughter ringing like music through the sterile confines of the hospital. "Ethan!" Her voice echoed through the ER one day, and he turned to see her shuffling toward him. Her frail frame slightly stooped, but her eyes bright with mischief. "Mrs. Thompson, you shouldn't be out here. You might catch a cold," he chided playfully as he approached her. "Oh, don't fuss over me, dear. I just wanted to share a story about the time I met a famous jazz musician back in the day," she said, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to draw in those around her. Ethan smiled, his heart warmed by her presence. "I'd love to hear it, but first let's get you checked out. We can chat while I do your vitals." As he led her to an examination room, the warmth of their conversation wrapped around them like a cozy blanket. Mrs. Thompson recounted her adventures, her stories full of color and life, painting a picture of a vibrant past that contrasted starkly with her current circumstances. As Ethan listened, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. In a world that often overlooked the elderly, he was honored to be her confidant. One afternoon, during a rare moment of respite, Ethan took his break outside. The sun warmed his face and he closed his eyes, savoring the brief escape from the hospital's frenetic pace. He had just started to relax when he spotted Mrs. Thompson across the street, struggling to walk. Her frail body swayed unsteadily as she clutched her shopping bag, determination etched on her weathered face. Ethan's heart raced, a familiar instinct kicking in. He knew the hospital's strict policies regarding breaks and time management, but he couldn't ignore her distress. With a quick glance at his watch, he decided that compassion outweighed protocol. He rushed across the street, his shoes pounding against the pavement as he called out to her. "Mrs. Thompson, let me help you." She looked up, surprise mingling with relief as Ethan reached her side. "Oh dear, you're too kind. I just wanted to pick up a few things, but these old legs aren't what they used to be," she confessed, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "Let me take that for you," Ethan said, gently relieving her of the heavy bag. "You shouldn't be carrying this all by yourself." As they walked back toward the hospital, Mrs. Thompson leaned on him for support, her gratitude palpable. "You're a good man, Ethan. Not many would take the time to help an old woman like me." "I believe everyone deserves a little kindness," he replied, his voice steady and sincere. "You've given me so much joy with your stories. It's the least I can do." However, the moment of warmth was abruptly interrupted when Mr. Davis, the hospital administrator, appeared at the entrance, his brow furrowed with disapproval. Ethan's stomach dropped at the sight of him, a man whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "What's going on here, Carter?" Mr. Davis's voice boomed, cutting through the air like a knife. Ethan straightened, instinctively shifting his weight to confront the administrator. "I was just helping Mrs. Thompson. She needed assistance." "Helping? You're on break, and you've left your post. Do you have any idea how many people are waiting for you inside?" Mr. Davis shot back, his eyes narrowing. Ethan felt a flush of anger rising within him, but he fought to keep his voice calm. "With all due respect, sir, Mrs. Thompson is a patient who comes here regularly. She was struggling, and I couldn't just stand by. Your job is to be in the ER, not playing the hero outside, Mr. Davis retorted, his tone dripping with condescension. This is a hospital, not a charity. You need to prioritize your responsibilities over your emotions, Carter. Tension hung thickly in the air, and Ethan could feel the weight of the administrator's words pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and replied, I understand the need for protocol, but this... He gestured toward Mrs. Thompson, who stood quietly beside him. This is about compassion. Sometimes we have to remember the humanity behind our roles. Mr. Davis scoffed, his lips curling into a disdainful smile. Compassion doesn't pay the bills, Ethan. I suggest you get back to work before you find yourself in more trouble than you bargained for. With that, Mr. Davis turned on his heel and strode back into the hospital, leaving Ethan and Mrs. Thompson standing in the wake of his harsh words. The warmth of the sun felt distant now, overshadowed by the weight of the confrontation. Don't let him get to you, dear, Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice a gentle reminder of the importance of kindness. You did the right thing. Ethan nodded, though the unease in his stomach lingered. He looked down at her, seeing the strength in her eyes. Thank you for saying that. It just feels like sometimes we forget that we're here for people, not just to follow rules. Rules are important, but they should never overshadow our empathy, she replied, a wisdom in her words that resonated deeply with him. As they made their way back into the hospital, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation with Mr. Davis was just the beginning of a greater struggle, one that would challenge not only his commitment to compassion, but also the very principles that had driven him to become a nurse in the first place. Little did he know that his resolve would soon be tested in ways he had never imagined, setting him on a path that would redefine his understanding of resilience and the true meaning of dignity. Ethan Carter stood outside Mr. Davis's office, his heart racing with a mix of dread and disbelief. The sterile, clinical atmosphere of the hospital felt suffocating, each passing second amplifying the weight of what was about to unfold. He had grown accustomed to the rhythmic chaos of the emergency room, where every second mattered, but this was different. This was a confrontation he never anticipated. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his scrubs and pushed the door open. Inside, Mr. Davis sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, the sunlight filtering in through the blinds casting stripes across his face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that betrayed nothing of the turmoil Ethan felt brewing in the pit of his stomach. As Ethan stepped forward, the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him in a chamber of uncertainty. Ethan, Mr. Davis began, his voice steady, devoid of warmth. I'm afraid we need to discuss your actions from yesterday. Ethan's mind raced back to the moment he had rushed to Mrs. Thompson's aid, the frail woman collapsing before him like a marionette with cut strings. He remembered the way her eyes had filled with gratitude as he helped her to her feet, completely oblivious to the consequences that would soon follow. I was just trying to help, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart pounding in his chest. Help? Mr. Davis echoed, his tone sharp. You violated our protocols, Ethan. You left your post during a busy shift to assist a patient who wasn't even in the hospital. This is gross misconduct. Ethan felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. But Mrs. Thompson needed me. She's a regular here, and you put the hospital at risk, Mr. Davis interrupted, his eyes narrowing. You're a nurse, Ethan. Your duty is to the patients here, not wandering outside helping those who don't belong in an ER. Do you understand the implications of your actions? Ethan fought against the rising tide of anger and despair. What about compassion? What about doing what's right? Compassion doesn't excuse negligence, Mr. Davis replied coldly, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. You're terminated, effective immediately. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He blinked, his vision blurring momentarily as he processed the reality of the termination letter. You can't be serious, he stammered. I've dedicated my life to this hospital. I've put my heart and soul into my work. Your dedication doesn't exempt you from accountability, Mr. Davis said, his voice unyielding. This letter is final. You can collect your belongings and leave. Ethan stood frozen, the world around him fading into a blur. He felt the walls closing in, the air thick with suffocating silence. "This isn't fair," he managed to say, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "You're punishing me for showing kindness?" Mr. Davis's expression softened for just a moment, but he quickly masked it again with professionalism. "This is a workplace, Ethan. It's not about fairness. It's about following the rules. You made your choice." With those final words, Ethan turned and walked out of the office, the termination letter gripped tightly in his hand. As he exited the hospital, the bustling sounds of the emergency room faded, replaced by the deafening silence of his thoughts. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The weight of shame settled heavily on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. In the days that followed, Ethan struggled to adjust to a life without the hospital, the place he had poured his heart into, where he had forged connections with patients and colleagues alike. He spent hours staring at the walls of his small apartment, the silence echoing the emptiness he felt inside. He had always been the provider, the one who kept things running smoothly for his family, and now he was left with nothing but a termination letter and the gnawing anxiety of unemployment. "Dad, are we still going to the park today?" his young daughter Lily asked one morning, her bright eyes shining with hope. Her innocence cut through him like a knife, piercing the fog of despair that had settled over him since his termination. Ethan forced a smile, but it felt strained. "Yeah, sweetheart. Of course. Just let me get ready, okay?" He watched her bounce off to the living room, her enthusiasm a stark contrast to the heaviness in his heart. How could he explain to her that he was no longer a nurse, that he had lost his job for something he believed was right? The shame of it all felt insurmountable. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself battling a relentless cycle of self-doubt and hopelessness. He applied for job after job, each rejection email feeling like a nail in his coffin. He could feel the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him. They relied on him, and he was failing them. One rainy afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The news anchor's voice droned on in the background, but he couldn't focus on the words. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of regret and frustration. Just as he was about to turn off the TV, a familiar face appeared on the screen. A report about the local community health clinic, highlighting their efforts to provide care for those in need. Something stirred within him. Perhaps he could still make a difference, even if it wasn't in the hospital. The clinic was known for helping the underserved, and he had always admired their work. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number listed on the screen. "Community Health Clinic, how can I help you?" a cheerful voice answered. "Hi, my name is Ethan Carter, and I'm a nurse. I'd like to volunteer," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I want to help people." "Of course, we'd love to have you," the receptionist replied enthusiastically. "Come by tomorrow, and we can discuss how you can get involved." As he hung up the phone, a flicker of hope ignited within him. Maybe this was his chance to reclaim his purpose, to stand up for what he believed in, even if it was outside the confines of the hospital. The following day, Ethan arrived at the clinic, feeling both nervous and excited. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical environment he had grown accustomed to. He was greeted by Sarah, the clinic director, whose passion for community health was palpable. "Welcome, Ethan. I've heard so much about you," she said, her smile brightening the room. "We're thrilled to have you here. Your experience will be invaluable to our patients." Ethan felt the weight of his despair begin to lift as he got swept up in the energy of the clinic. They discussed his background, his passion for nursing, and the reasons he wanted to volunteer. Sarah listened intently, nodding along as he spoke, her eyes reflecting understanding and empathy. "I'm sorry about what happened at the hospital," she said gently, sensing the lingering pain in his voice. "You stood up for what you believed in, and that takes courage. Not everyone has that kind of heart." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "I just wish it hadn't cost me my job," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes the right path isn't the easiest one," she replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But you're not alone in this. We're a community, and we'll support each other." Her words resonated deeply with him, igniting a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. As he began volunteering at the clinic, Ethan found solace in helping those who came through the doors. Each patient a reminder of why he had become a nurse in the first place. The gratitude in their eyes, the stories they shared, it all filled the void left by his termination. But even as he immersed himself in the work, the specter of his past loomed over him. He was still grappling with the injustice he had faced, the unfairness of being punished for his compassion. And as much as he tried to move forward, the shadows of doubt and betrayal lingered in the corners of his mind. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, Ethan found himself wandering through the nearby park. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape. It was a beautiful scene, but the weight of his thoughts felt heavy. He missed the camaraderie of his colleagues, the sense of purpose that came from being part of a team. As he sat on a bench, lost in thought, he spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Mrs. Thompson, her frail frame silhouetted against the vibrant colors of the sunset. His heart raced with a mix of joy and concern. He hadn't seen her since that fateful day outside the hospital, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she might have some wisdom to share. "Mrs. Thompson!" he called out, rising from the bench. She turned, a smile breaking across her face as she recognized him. "Ethan, my dear, what a surprise!" she exclaimed, her voice warm and inviting. "How have you been?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Not great, to be honest. I lost my job at the hospital." Her expression softened and she patted the bench beside her. "Come, sit with me. Tell me what happened." As he recounted the events that led to his termination, Ethan felt a mix of relief and vulnerability. Ethan Carter stood outside the local community health clinic, the sun casting a warm glow on the brick facade, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his heart since losing his job. The air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, mingling with the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the clinic. He had come to volunteer, hoping to find solace in helping those in need, a flicker of purpose amidst the turmoil of his life. As he stepped inside, the clinic buzzed with activity. Patients filled the waiting room, chatting quietly in a sea of mismatched chairs. The walls were adorned with colorful posters about healthy living, a far cry from the sterile environment of the hospital he had once known. A sense of community enveloped him, and he took a deep breath, feeling a hint of his old self returning. "Ethan!" a voice called out, breaking his reverie. He turned to find Sarah, a healthcare advocate who had been working tirelessly at the clinic. Her fiery red hair danced as she approached, and her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "I'm so glad you're here. We have a lot to do before the health fair next week." "Thanks, Sarah," Ethan replied, a smile breaking through his cloud of despair. "I'm ready to help in any way I can." "Great. Let's start by organizing the supplies for the fair," she said, gesturing toward a room filled with boxes of medical supplies, pamphlets, and banners. "We need to make sure we have everything we need for the residents. It's going to be a big event." As they sorted through the items, Ethan felt a growing sense of camaraderie with Sarah. She was passionate and driven, her dedication infectious. They chatted about their backgrounds, sharing stories that revealed a common commitment to social justice and healthcare access. "Why did you become a healthcare advocate?" Ethan asked, curiosity piquing as he handed Sarah a stack of pamphlets. Sarah paused, her expression thoughtful. "I grew up in a neighborhood where healthcare was a luxury. My mother struggled to afford basic medical services, and it made me realize how unfair the system can be. I want to change that." Ethan nodded, feeling a connection. "I know what you mean. I've seen firsthand how people are treated based on their circumstances. It's disheartening." "Exactly," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing with passion. "That's why this health fair is so important. We can provide free screenings and resources to those who might not otherwise have access. It's a small step, but it can make a huge difference." As they worked side by side, Ethan felt a flicker of hope rekindling within him. This was what he had been missing: purpose. He realized that even though he had lost his job, he could still make an impact, no matter how small. The days passed quickly as Ethan immersed himself in the preparations for the health fair. With Sarah's guidance, they reached out to local businesses for donations, recruited volunteers, and spread the word throughout the community. Each evening, Ethan returned home tired but fulfilled, sharing stories of their progress with his wife, Julia, who listened with admiration. "You're really making a difference, Ethan," she said one night, her eyes shining with pride. I can see the joy in you again. It's like you found your calling." "I think I have," he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "This feels right. Helping people is what I was meant to do." However, as the fair drew nearer, Ethan's sense of accomplishment was overshadowed by a looming concern. During a conversation with Sarah, he learned something that struck him like a thunderbolt. "Did you hear about Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah asked as they sorted through donations one afternoon. Her tone darkened, and Ethan's heart sank. "No, what happened?" he asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. "She's facing eviction," Sarah said quietly, her expression grave. "I heard from a neighbor that she's behind on her bills. It's heartbreaking." Ethan felt a rush of panic. Mrs. Thompson had always been a source of wisdom and warmth in his life, her stories bringing light to his darkest days. The thought of her losing her home ignited a fierce determination within him. "I have to help her," he declared, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I can't let that happen." "I'll help too," Sarah said, her brows furrowing in concern. "But we need a plan. We can't tackle this alone." Ethan nodded, already formulating ideas in his mind. "Maybe we can raise some funds at the health fair. If we can get enough people involved, we could help her catch up on her bills." "That's a brilliant idea," Sarah replied, her enthusiasm returning. "We can set up a donation booth and spread the word about Mrs. Thompson's situation. The community could really rally around her." As they discussed their plan, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had to act quickly. Mrs. Thompson had always been there for him, sharing her wisdom and kindness when he needed it most. Now it was his turn to return the favor. Once the fair was over, Ethan visited Mrs. Thompson's modest apartment, his heart heavy with concern. The familiar smell of lavender greeted him as he entered, a scent that reminded him of her gentle spirit. She sat on her worn-out couch, her frail hands clasped together in her lap, worry etched on her face. "Ethan, dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What brings you here?" "Mrs. Thompson, I came to talk to you about something important," he said, sitting across from her. "I heard that you're having trouble with your bills." Her eyes widened, and she sighed deeply. "It's true. I've fallen behind, and the landlord has threatened to evict me. I never wanted to burden anyone with my troubles." "You're not a burden," Ethan insisted, his voice firm. "You've always been there for me. Now it's my turn to help you. We're organizing a fundraiser at the health fair to assist you. I won't let you lose your home." Mrs. Thompson's eyes glimmered with tears. "Oh, Ethan, you're such a kind soul. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, determination igniting in his chest. "Just know that you're not alone. We're going to fight this together." As he left her apartment, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The health fair was not just about providing health care. It was about building a community, standing up for those in need, and ensuring that no one felt abandoned. With Sarah by his side and the support of their community, he was ready to take on the challenge ahead. In the coming days, Ethan poured his heart into the preparations for the health fair. He reached out to former colleagues, friends, and even strangers to rally support. The more people he spoke to about Mrs. Thompson's situation, the more they expressed their willingness to help. The outpouring of kindness reminded him of the innate goodness in people, which had been overshadowed by his recent struggles. As the health fair approached, excitement buzzed in the air. Ethan and Sarah worked late into the nights, setting up booths, arranging for local healthcare professionals to volunteer, and finalizing the details of the fundraiser for Mrs. Thompson. Each step brought them closer to their goal, and Ethan felt invigorated by the sense of purpose that enveloped him. However, deep down, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and perhaps moments of doubt. But he also knew that he was not alone. With the community behind him and the fire of determination in his heart, Ethan Carter was ready to fight for what was right. The morning sun filtered through the colorful banners that lined the community center, casting a warm glow over the health fair that Ethan Carter had worked tirelessly to organize. The air buzzed with energy as volunteers hustled about, setting up booths and preparing for the influx of residents eager to take advantage of the free health services being offered. Ethan stood at the entrance, a smile stretching across his face as he welcomed families and individuals into the bustling space. "Ethan, over here," Sarah called out, waving enthusiastically from the booth where they were offering free health screenings. Her passion for community health was infectious, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him every time he collaborated with her. He rushed over, adjusting his name tag, which had seen better days but still bore the title of volunteer nurse. "Are we ready?" he asked, glancing around at the organized chaos. "Absolutely. We've got blood pressure checks, diabetes screenings, and even a nutrition workshop lined up," she replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I think this is going to be our best turnout yet." As they exchanged plans for the day, Ethan noticed an elderly couple approaching. It was Mr. and Mrs. Harris, two familiar faces from the neighborhood. The couple had been regulars at the clinic where he now volunteered, and their presence filled him with warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. Mrs. Harris, how are you both today?" Ethan greeted them. "Just fine, Ethan. Excited about all this," Mr. Harris replied, gesturing to the activities around them. "We could use some of that free blood pressure monitoring, don't you think, dear?" Mrs. Harris chuckled softly, nudging her husband. "Yes, but only if you promise not to complain about the results this time." Ethan laughed, feeling a sense of belonging that had been missing since his termination from the hospital. Here, among these people, he felt appreciated and valued, not just as a nurse, but as a member of the community. As the day progressed, residents began to filter in, filling the center with laughter, conversation, and the occasional cry of a child. Ethan moved from booth to booth, checking on the volunteers and making sure everything ran smoothly. He witnessed firsthand the impact of their efforts. People were receiving vital health services they might not have sought otherwise. "Ethan, come look at this," Sarah called from the nutrition workshop, where a local dietitian was explaining the importance of healthy eating. Ethan approached and watched as the residents engaged with the presenter, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. "This is incredible," he said, turning to Sarah. "I can't believe how many people are here." "I know. It's amazing what a little community spirit can do," she replied, beaming with pride. "We're making a difference, one person at a time." Just then, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a notification from his email. He frowned as he read the subject line, "Termination Confirmation." His heart sank and he instinctively glanced at Sarah, who was still engrossed in the workshop. He stepped aside, opening the email with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The message was concise and cold, stating that his termination from the hospital was now permanent, effective immediately, and that he was barred from returning to the premises. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, threatening to overshadow the day's success. "Ethan?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts as she approached. "Is everything okay?" He forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "Yeah, just a little overwhelmed, I guess." "Want to talk about it?" she asked gently, concern etched on her face. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the crowd. The laughter and chatter felt distant, an echo of a life he once knew. "Not right now. Let's focus on this." "All right, just know I'm here if you need to vent," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. As the day continued, Ethan pushed aside his worries, immersing himself in the joy around him. He helped with health screenings, sharing light-hearted banter with the attendees. He felt alive, invigorated by the sense of community and purpose he had longed for since his unjust termination. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue through the windows, Ethan found himself standing at the back of the center, watching the last few residents leave. A mix of pride and melancholy washed over him. They had accomplished something meaningful today, yet the shadow of the hospital loomed over him. "Hey, you," Sarah called out, breaking into his thoughts. "You did an amazing job today. We couldn't have done it without you." He turned to her, and for the first time that day, he felt a spark of hope. "Thanks, Sarah. It really means a lot." "Let's take a picture to celebrate," she suggested, pulling out her phone. "We'll capture this moment." Ethan smiled, and as they posed with the volunteers, he felt a sense of camaraderie that lightened his heart. The camera clicked, freezing the moment in time, a testimony to their hard work and the community spirit they had nurtured together. As they wrapped up the event, Ethan received another jolt of anxiety when he spotted a familiar figure approaching from the entrance. It was Mrs. Thompson, her frail frame supported by a sturdy cane. Despite her age, her eyes sparkled with life. and Ethan felt a rush of affection for the woman who had unknowingly become his guiding light. "Ethan, my dear," she exclaimed, her voice warm and welcoming. "I heard about the health fair and just had to come see it for myself." "It's wonderful to see you, Mrs. Thompson. How are you feeling?" he asked, his concern for her well-being evident. "I'm doing much better now that I have you in my corner," she replied, her smile brightening the dimming room. "I've been thinking about you, my boy. How are you holding up with everything?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his termination pressing down on him once more. "It's been tough, but I'm finding my way. Today was a good reminder of why I love what I do." Mrs. Thompson nodded knowingly, her expression shifting to one of concern. "You mustn't lose hope, Ethan. There's strength in community, and you have a whole neighborhood behind you." Her words resonated with him, igniting a flicker of determination within. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I appreciate your support more than you know." As they chatted, Ethan felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He knew that he couldn't let the hospital's decision crush his spirit. The community had rallied around him, and he had to honor that support by continuing to fight for what was right. Later that evening, after the fair was dismantled and the last of the volunteers had left, Ethan sat in his living room, the flickering light of the television casting shadows across the walls. He pulled out the termination letter again, scanning the words that had felt like a death sentence, only hours before. But now, as he read them, a new resolve began to form in his mind. "Fight back," he whispered to himself, the determination in his voice echoing in the quiet room. He could gather support from the community, file a lawsuit, and make his case against the hospital. He had to believe that justice was possible. As Ethan contemplated his next steps, he felt an unexpected surge of energy. He imagined reaching out to those who had supported him during the health fair, harnessing their voices and experiences to shed light on the injustices within the hospital system. The thought ignited a fire in his belly. It was time to take action. With each breath, Ethan felt the weight of his situation lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. Tomorrow, he would begin assembling a plan, gathering testimonies, and rallying his community. He would not be silenced. He would fight for his dignity and for those who had been overlooked and mistreated. And as he drifted into sleep that night, Ethan's dreams were filled not with despair, but with visions of hope, resilience, and a community united in the face of adversity. The fight was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the clutter of papers and files overwhelming the surface. The early morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the determination etched on his face. He was on the brink of a legal battle that could change everything, not only for himself but for countless others who had suffered in silence. With each passing day, the evidence he'd been gathering painted a more troubling picture of the systemic neglect and discrimination that thrived within the walls of the hospital where he once worked. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. She had been his steadfast ally since he began volunteering at the community health clinic, a passionate advocate for healthcare justice. They had spent hours together, poring over testimonies from other employees, uncovering a shocking pattern of neglect that extended far beyond his own case. Ethan took a deep breath and reached for his phone, scrolling through the messages they had exchanged. Sarah had suggested they compile a list of witnesses who could testify about the hospital's practices. Her enthusiasm was contagious, but the gravity of their mission weighed heavily on him. He had never envisioned becoming a whistleblower, yet here he was, about to expose deep-seated issues that could rattle the very foundation of the institution he once admired. The phone rang, snapping him back to reality. It was Sarah. "Hey, Ethan, how's the prep going?" Her voice was bright, filled with the kind of energy that could spark hope in the bleakest situations. "Honestly, it's a bit daunting. I'm trying to make sense of all these testimonies." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I never thought I'd be doing this. I just wanted to help people." "And that's exactly why you're doing this. You're standing up for those who can't," Sarah replied, her tone firm yet encouraging. "Remember, it's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone who's been affected by the hospital's policies." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Her words ignited a flicker of resolve within him. "You're right. I can't let fear stop me. I've seen too many people suffer because of this system. Good. Let's meet later and go over everything. I think we're on to something big here, Sarah said, her voice brimming with excitement. I'll bring the latest testimonies we've gathered. There's a pattern, Ethan, and we need to highlight it. As they hung up, Ethan felt a surge of motivation. He glanced at the stack of papers before him, each one a story of neglect, of patients who were shuffled aside, of nurses and doctors who had been silenced for speaking up. It was time to take that leap, to stand up for justice. Later that afternoon, they met at a small cafe near the clinic. The air was filled with the rich aroma of coffee, and the walls were adorned with local art, a stark contrast to the heaviness that lingered in their conversation. Ethan and Sarah settled at a corner table, their laptops open and a mountain of papers spread before them. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a testimony written by a nurse who had worked in the ER for over a decade. She claims that management often ignored staffing shortages, leading to unsafe conditions for both patients and staff. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. Ethan leaned closer, reading the words carefully. And here, she mentions a specific incident where a patient was left unattended for over an hour because there weren't enough nurses on shift. This could be crucial. They spent hours dissecting the testimonies, piecing together a narrative that painted a vivid picture of the hospital's failings. Each story added weight to their cause, fueling Ethan's conviction. He could feel the momentum building, a wave of support swelling around him. As they wrapped up their meeting, Sarah leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile on her face. "I think we have enough here to start gaining some media attention. We need to make sure people know what's happening." Ethan felt a thrill at the thought. "You really think we can make a difference?" "Absolutely. You're already a symbol of resilience, Ethan. People will rally behind you," she said, her eyes shining with conviction. "Let's not waste any time." Over the next few weeks, as they prepared for the media campaign, Ethan found himself in a whirlwind of interviews and public speaking engagements. He was no longer just a nurse. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered in silence for too long. The stories he shared resonated with many, igniting a fire within the community. But with the rising momentum came an unexpected shadow. One evening, as Ethan returned home from another successful rally, he noticed a strange car parked across the street. Its dark windows offered no hint of the occupants within, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. He dismissed it as paranoia, attributing his unease to the stress of the past few weeks. That night, as he lay in bed, the memory of the car lingered in his mind, gnawing at his peace. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the immense support he had received. The community had rallied around him, sharing their own stories of injustice, amplifying each other's voices. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. The following day, after a successful press conference that garnered significant media attention, Ethan returned home to find a letter slipped under his door. The envelope was plain, with no return address. His heart raced as he tore it open, revealing a single typed message: "Drop the case or else." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The threat was clear, and his mind raced with fear for his family. He had become a target, and now the stakes were higher than ever. He paced the living room, the weight of the letter heavy in his hands. What should he do? He could feel the walls closing in around him, the fear that had once felt distant, now palpable and suffocating. He thought of his wife and children, their faces flashing before him, innocent and unaware of the danger that loomed. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah, checking in after the press conference. He hesitated before answering, his mind still swirling with the implications of the threat. "Ethan, you were amazing today. The media loved your story," she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. "Thanks, Sarah," he replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "But I just received an anonymous threat." Silence fell on the other end of the line. "A threat? What do you mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. Ethan recounted the details of the letter, his heart racing as he spoke. "I'm scared, Sarah. I don't want to put my family in danger." "Listen to me," she said firmly. "You can't back down now. This is bigger than us. You have to report it to the police." "I know, but what if it escalates? I can't let anything happen to them, he said, the fear in his voice unmistakable. Ethan, you're fighting for justice. You're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for everyone who's been wronged. We can take precautions. We'll figure this out together, Sarah reassured him. He took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of courage return. You're right. I can't let fear dictate my actions. I'll report it, but I'll also talk to my family about being cautious. As they continued to talk, Ethan felt the resolve within him begin to solidify. He would not let this threat deter him. He had a mission, and he had the support of a community that believed in him. With every story shared, he was drawing closer to justice, and no anonymous threat could extinguish that fire. Ethan Carter stood at the front of the courtroom, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. The stark, fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the polished wood of the benches and the solemn expressions of the jurors. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in his hands, and glanced at Sarah, who sat in the front row, her eyes encouraging and steadfast. Today was the day he would finally present his case against the hospital that had unjustly fired him. Mr. Carter, you may proceed, the judge announced, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed room. Ethan stepped forward, clutching the stack of papers that represented not just his fight for justice, but the struggles of countless others who had suffered at the hands of a system that prioritized profit over people. He cleared his throat and began, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I stand before you not just for myself, but for every nurse and patient whose voice has been silenced by the policies of this hospital. He felt the weight of their gazes, and it fueled his resolve. As he recounted the events leading to his termination, he spoke of Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had become a symbol of compassion in his life. He detailed the moment he had rushed outside to help her, ignoring the strict rules that governed the ER. I was fired for showing empathy, he said, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. But I refuse to accept that caring for someone in need is a crime. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan could see the jurors leaning forward, their interest piqued. He continued, recounting the systemic neglect he had witnessed in the hospital, the countless patients who had been treated as mere numbers instead of human beings. This is about more than one man's job. It's about the ethics of our healthcare system. It's about all of us, he asserted, his voice rising with passion. Just as he was beginning to feel the momentum shift in his favor, the courtroom doors swung open with a creak, and a hush fell over the crowd. All heads turned as Mrs. Thompson, dressed in her usual modest attire but with an air of unexpected confidence, entered the room. Ethan's heart raced. She had agreed to be a witness, but he hadn't anticipated her arrival to be so dramatic. Your Honor, I would like to call Mrs. Thompson to the stand, Ethan said, a mixture of hope and anxiety bubbling in his chest. As she approached the witness stand, Ethan couldn't help but admire her resilience. This woman, who had faced so much hardship, was now standing up for what was right. He watched as she took the oath, her hands trembling slightly but her gaze unwavering. Mrs. Thompson, Ethan began, can you tell the court about your experiences at the hospital and what you witnessed regarding my termination? Mrs. Thompson looked around the room, her eyes landing on the jurors before she began to speak. I've been visiting the hospital for years, and I've seen how the staff is treated. They are overworked and underappreciated. I've watched as nurses like Ethan care for patients with all their hearts, often at the expense of their own well-being. Her voice shook slightly, but her message was clear. Ethan felt a swell of pride. She was speaking the truth, and he hoped the jury could see it as clearly as he did. Can you tell us about the incident that led to Ethan's firing? One of the attorneys asked, prompting her to continue. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath. I was outside the hospital on that fateful day, struggling to make my way to my appointment. I saw Ethan rush out to help me. He didn't care about the clock, he cared about me. But what happened next is what shocked me the most. She hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who offered her an encouraging nod. I've overheard conversations among the staff. There are practices in place that prioritize profits over patient care, policies that prevent nurses from giving the attention and time required for proper care. I believe Ethan was targeted because he dared to challenge that system. Gasps erupted from the audience, and Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't realized she had been privy to such conversations. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He was not just fired for helping me, he was a threat to the hospital's image and their bottom line. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the weight of her testimony settled in. Ethan felt a surge of hope. This was the turning point he had been waiting for. The attorney for the hospital quickly rose to object, but the judge silenced him with a wave of his hand. "Let her finish," he ordered. Mrs. Thompson's voice grew more resolute. "The truth is, there are many like Ethan who care deeply for their patients, but are stifled by the policies of a system that doesn't put people first. I stand here today to say that it's time for change." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan's heart swelled with gratitude. He could see the jurors were moved, their expressions shifting from passive observers to engaged participants in this battle for justice. But then, just as the tide seemed to be turning in their favor, a commotion erupted in the back of the courtroom. Ethan turned to see Mr. Davis, the hospital administrator, storming in, his face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous," he shouted, his voice cutting through the solemnity of the room. "This is a blatant attempt to undermine our hospital's credibility." "Mr. Davis, you will remain silent," the judge commanded, his voice firm. Ethan's heart sank. He could see the tension rising, and he feared that this would disrupt the momentum they had built. But then, Mrs. Thompson turned to face Mr. Davis, her expression fierce. "You don't get to silence us anymore, Mr. Davis. The people deserve to know the truth." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was the moment he had hoped for, the moment when the truth could no longer be hidden. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and the jurors appeared more attentive, their interest piqued by the confrontation. "Your Honor," Ethan said, taking a step forward, "I would like to present evidence that supports Mrs. Thompson's claims." He gestured to Sarah, who was ready with a folder filled with testimonies and records of the hospital's practices. As he began to lay out the evidence, a sense of urgency filled the air. "What we're dealing with here is not just my case. It's about the lives that are affected by a system that prioritizes profit over care. Each one of these testimonies shows the real impact of policies that dehumanize patients and overburden staff." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom as a stack of papers fell from the table, scattering across the floor. Ethan's heart raced as he crouched down to gather the documents, but as he reached for one, a familiar name caught his eye, one that made his blood run cold. "Wait," Ethan murmured, picking up a page that had slipped from the pile. His eyes widened as he scanned the name. Mrs. Thompson had a connection to Mr. Davis. He lifted his gaze, meeting her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "Mrs. Thompson, you knew him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression resolute. "He was my husband's business partner before the hospital's administration took a turn for the worse. I didn't want to involve you in this, Ethan, but the truth has to come out." The revelation hung in the air, swirling with implications. Ethan felt his world tilt on its axis. What did this mean for their case? Could it jeopardize everything they had fought for? "Your Honor," Mr. Davis shouted, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "This is a clear attempt to discredit my character and the hospital's integrity." Ethan's mind raced as he processed the new information. He had been fighting against a system that was more intertwined with his life than he had ever realized. Mrs. Thompson's connection to Mr. Davis could change everything, could expose deeper corruption within the hospital that had led to his firing. "Your Honor, I request a recess," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I need time to investigate this connection further." The judge nodded, and the gavel rang through the chaos of the courtroom, signaling a break. As the room began to clear, Ethan turned to Mrs. Thompson, who looked equally baffled and encouraged. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "Whatever it takes." Ethan nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of the fight ahead. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight for justice had just become more complicated, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom buzzed with energy as he prepared for the next chapter in his struggle, a fight that was now about uncovering the truth, not just for himself, but for every patient and caregiver who had been wronged.